The mist curled around the trees of xylos like phantom fingers, their tips illuminated by the bioluminescent fungi that clung to the massive trunks. In this eternal twilight, where the dense canopy filtered the twin suns to a perpetual dusk, Kale moved with practiced precision through his morning routine. 17 push-ups, 34 sit-ups, a careful inventory of supplies that hadn't changed in weeks. The ritual was comforting, a scaffolding of normalcy in a world designed to kill. The small observation station he called home sat perched on the thick branch of an ancient tree, nearly 60 meters above the deadly forest floor. Constructed of salvaged metal and composite materials, it was barely large enough for one person, which suited Kale perfectly. The cramped quarters were lined with monitoring equipment, survival gear, and the sparse personal effects of a man who had fled from his past but brought his discipline with him. Kale wiped condensation from the single viewport and stared out at the luminous landscape. 5 years on this moon, and still the beauty of it could arrest him, momentarily quieting the ghosts that whispered in his mind. The ethereal glow of the forest, shimmering in blues and greens, was nature's reminder that beauty and danger often wore the same face. He adjusted the bandana that kept his sweat-dampened hair from his eyes, the gray at his temples the only obvious sign of his 43 years. His body, lean and corded with muscle, bore other markers of time, scars that mapped a history he preferred not to discuss. The comms unit remained silent, as it had for years now. Kale preferred it that way. The last transmission he'd received had been notification that his dishonorable discharge had been processed. After what happened on Tacitus Prime, the silence was a mercy. Sergeant Kale Voros, combat medic, had died there with his squad. What remained was simply a man trying to live with the memories of those he couldn't save. His daily check of the monitoring systems was as automatic as breathing. Temperature fluctuations, atmospheric composition, movement patterns of the larger predators, all normal. Until a spike in the energy readings made him frown. The anomaly was subtle but distinct. Something was emitting energy signatures that didn't match any of the native fauna. Kale's initial instinct was to ignore it. Whatever, or whoever, had come to Xylos was not his concern. He had chosen exile precisely to escape such entanglements. Then he felt it, a wisp of sensation that was neither sound nor image, but something in between. A psychic impression of terror and desperate need that slipped past the mental barriers he'd built over years of solitude. Asterisk help. Please, asterisk. Kale stiffened, his hand automatically reaching for the pulse rifle that was never far from reach. Psychic communication was rare, but not unknown in the galaxy. He'd encountered species with such abilities during his service. He closed his eyes, focusing on the fading impression, trying to determine its direction. The plea had been weak, faltering, like the last gasp of someone drowning. Not your problem, he muttered to himself, reaching for the switch to silence the alert. His fingers hovered over it, trembling slightly. Not again. The memories crashed through his carefully constructed walls. The screams of his squad as the ambush tore them apart, his desperate attempts to save them, the weight of Captain Lena in his arms as the light faded from her eyes. "You're a medic, Voros," she had whispered through blood-flecked lips. Asterisk, save who you can. Asterisk. He had failed her then. Fail them all. With a curse, Kale grabbed his emergency pack and strapped the pulse rifle to his back. Whatever was happening out there probably wasn't his business, but he couldn't ignore a distress call. Not again. Some ghosts, he'd learned, could only be silenced by action. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Lyra ran until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to buckle beneath her. The dense undergrowth of xylos tore at her skin, leaving shallow cuts across her arms and face that stung in the humid air. She didn't dare stop to tend them. They were too close. Her pursuers were relentless, using tech far more sophisticated than anything she'd expected. Thermal imaging, motion sensors, and something that seemed to track her unique energy signature. Technology specifically designed to hunt her kind. Lyra's large, pupil-less eyes, adapted for low-light conditions, scanned the forest for a place to hide. The feline grace of her movements was compromised by exhaustion and fear, but still, she moved with more agility than most species could manage in the treacherous terrain. The silver markings along her skin, decorative to an untrained eye but actually sophisticated biotech enhancements, had grown dull during her days of flight. Her body was conserving energy, shutting down non-essential functions. Even her empathic abilities, usually a constant background hum of information, had narrowed to a desperate focus on survival. She paused behind the massive trunk of a tree, pressing her back against the rough bark as she tried to steady her breathing. Her hand clutched the small device secured in a pouch at her waist. The reason they hunted her, the secret that had cost her everything. The sound of a snapping branch sent her heart racing again. They were getting closer. Lyra pushed away from the tree, prepared to run again, when a faint whirring sound caught her attention. Too late, she recognized the high-pitched frequency. The trap activated with a soft pulse of energy that knocked her from her feet. A net of crackling blue energy materialized around her, contracting painfully as she struggled against it. Each movement caused the energy field to tighten, sending waves of agony through her nervous system. It was designed not to kill, but to immobilize and weaken. A hunter's trap meant to deliver prey alive but helpless. Lyra tried to scream, but the energy field constricted her chest, making it difficult to breathe, let alone call for help. In desperation, she reached out with her mind, sending a psychic plea into the vastness of the forest, knowing it was futile. There was no one on this moon who would help her. The scientists at the research station would only hand her back to her pursuers, perhaps with an apology for the inconvenience of the hunt. Her vision began to blur as the trap drained her energy, siphoning it to power its own systems in a cruel efficiency. Soon she would be too weak to resist at all. The mercenaries would find her, package her up, and deliver her back to the Institute, where Dr. Severin would extract the information from her mind piece by agonizing piece. As consciousness began to slip away, Lyra focused on one final, desperate psychic call. Not targeted, just a blind plea hurled into the void. Asterisk help. Please. Asterisk. She didn't expect an answer. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Kale moved through the forest with the methodical caution of someone intimately familiar with hostile environments. His years on Xylos had taught him the rhythms of this deadly ecosystem, which paths to take, which sounds meant danger, which plants would kill with a mere touch. The energy signature he detected was approximately 2 kilometers southwest of his station. Not a casual stroll in a place like Xylos. He kept his rifle ready, eyes constantly scanning for threats. The indigenous predators were problem enough, but if there were off-worlders in the forest, that introduced a whole new category of danger. An hour into his trek, Kale froze at a sound that didn't belong, the faint mechanical whir of anti-grav propulsion. He dropped into a crouch, blending into the vegetation as a scout drone passed overhead. Military grade, from the looks of it. Definitely not ecological researchers. Hunters, then, not uncommon on frontier worlds, though usually they sought permission from any established settlements. Not that Kale's hermitage counted as a settlement, but the research station on the far side of the moon would have registered the arrival of a hunting party, unless they weren't here legally. Kale waited until the drone had passed before continuing, more cautious now. The energy spike he detected was getting stronger, its unusual pattern becoming clearer. It wasn't a ship or standard equipment. It had an oscillating quality that reminded him of certain restraint technologies he'd encountered during his service. A capture device. Someone, or something, was trapped. He quickened his pace, moving as silently as possible. The forest grew denser here, the bioluminescent light creating shifting patterns that disoriented the unfamiliar. Kale navigated by memory and the faint signal from his handheld scanner. The sound reached him first, a high-pitched whine just at the edge of hearing, the kind that set teeth on edge and activated primal warning systems in the brain. Then he saw it, a pulsing blue net of energy suspended between 2 massive tree roots, and within it, a figure curled in pain. Kale approached cautiously, rifle ready. It could be a trap, designed to lure and prey with the distress of another. But as he drew closer, he could see the figure more clearly. Humanoid, but definitely not human, with sleek, pale skin marked with delicate silver patterns. The face, contorted in pain, had a distinctly feline cast, with large eyes now half-closed in semi-consciousness. He recognized the species from his military days, Zealer from the Andromeda colonies. Rare this far into the outer systems. Even rarer to find one alone and hunted. The energy trap was military-grade, designed to incapacitate without killing, perfect for capturing valuable targets. It was slowly draining the Zealer's life force, converting it to power to maintain its own integrity. Vicious but efficient. A twig snapped somewhere to his left. Kale dropped flat to the ground, eyes scanning the tree line. A moment later, he spotted them, two figures, in camouflage exoskeletons that enhanced their movements and strength. Mercenaries, by the look of their mismatched gear. Professional enough to be dangerous. They were converging on the trap, moving with the confidence of predators who knew their prey was secured. Kale had perhaps 2 minutes before they reached the Zealer. He had a choice to make. Turn back now, retreat to his sanctuary, preserve the isolation he'd built, or interfere in something that was absolutely none of his business and likely to end badly for him. The Zealer's eyes opened slightly, unfocused but aware enough to register his presence. There was no plea in that gaze, no expectation of salvation, just the resigned recognition of another threat. Kale made his decision. He pulled a small device from his pack and activated it, tossing it into the undergrowth about 20 meters from his position. 3 seconds later, it released a pulse that mimicked the energy signature of a large predator. Almost immediately, the mercenaries changed direction, moving toward the new threat. Working quickly now, Kale approached the trap. Up close, he could see the Zealer was female, her breathing shallow and labored, silver markings dull and flickering. The control node of the trap was embedded in the ground beneath the net, a small black box humming with energy. Kale reached into his pack again, extracting a device he'd salvaged from his military days. The Universal Disruptor wasn't exactly legal for civilians, but then, he wasn't exactly registered as resident on Xylos either. "Hold on," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if the Zealer could hear him. "This might hurt." He pressed the disruptor against the control node and activated it. The energy net flickered, its steady blue pulse becoming erratic. The Zealer arched in pain as the energy field fluctuated wildly. Kale gritted his teeth, adjusting the disruptor's frequency. With a sound like shattering glass, the energy field collapsed. The Zealer dropped to the ground, her body limp but still breathing. Kale moved quickly to her side, basic medical training taking over as he checked her vital signs. Pulse rapid but present, breathing irregular, numerous superficial wounds. She needed medical attention, but first they needed to get away from here. A distant shout indicated his distraction wouldn't hold the mercenaries for long. Kale scooped up the unconscious Zealer, surprised by how light she was despite being nearly as tall as him. Her skin was fever-hot against his, and he could feel the rapid flutter of her heartbeat. "You'd better be worth this," he muttered, adjusting his grip and starting back the way he'd come, moving as quickly as he dared. The added weight made navigating the treacherous terrain more difficult, but Kale pushed on, driven by the knowledge that hunters would soon become the hunted. The journey back to his station took twice as long, every step a careful calculation of speed versus safety. By the time the familiar outline of his tree-mounted home came into view, Kale's muscles burned with effort, and his clothes were soaked with sweat. The Zealer had not regained consciousness, though occasionally she stirred with a small sound of distress. Kale activated the lift platform with his voice command, grateful for the whirring mechanism that would carry them up to safety. As they ascended, he scanned the forest below for signs of pursuit. Nothing yet, but it was only a matter of time. People who used military-grade capture tech wouldn't give up their quarry easily. The small interior of his station, which had always felt adequately sized for one, now seemed impossibly cramped with the addition of a second being. Kale placed the Zealer carefully on his narrow bunk, then moved quickly to secure the station, shutting down all non-essential systems that might emit trackable energy signatures, activating the simple but effective security measures he'd installed years ago. Only then did he turn his full attention to his unexpected guest. In the better light of his station, he could assess her injuries more thoroughly. The trap had left electrical burns where it had made direct contact with her skin, and her silver markings were still unnaturally dull. Numerous cuts and abrasions suggested she'd been running through the forest for some time before being captured. Kale retrieved his medical kit, more comprehensive than most would expect for a hermit, a remnant of his medic days. He began cleaning and treating the wounds with practiced efficiency, trying to ignore the memories that threatened to surface with each familiar motion. Different wounds, different species, same desperation to preserve life. The Zealer's eyes flew open as he applied antiseptic to a particularly deep cut on her arm. She recoiled violently, nearly falling from the bunk in her panic. Her eyes, solid amber without visible pupils, fixed on him with terror and confusion. Kale raised his hand slowly, showing her the medical supplies. "I'm trying to help," he said, keeping his voice low and calm. "You're safe here. For now." She didn't seem to understand his words, or perhaps couldn't process them through her fear. Her gaze darted around the small station, assessing exits, threats, potential weapons. A cornered animal seeking escape. "The trap was killing you," Kale continued, still not moving. "I got you out, brought you here. Those hunters are still out there, but they can't get to you right now." Her breathing slowed slightly, though wariness remained etched in every line of her body. After a long moment, she raised a trembling hand to her throat, then to her temple, then made a gesture of frustration. "Can't speak?" Kale guessed. Or, translator not working? She nodded at the second suggestion, then winced at the movement. Her hand went to a small device partially embedded behind her ear, standard translation tech, but apparently damaged. Kale considered the situation. His station didn't have sophisticated translation equipment, but he did have basic repair tools. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the device. She hesitated, then gave a small nod, though her body remained tense. Kale moved slowly, telegraphing each motion as he approached. The translator was a common civilian model, designed for ease of use rather than durability. A small panel had come loose, and one of the connection points was scorched, likely damage from the energy trap. "Basic fix," he murmured, reaching for his toolkit. "No promises, but I might be able to get it partially working." As he worked on the delicate device, Kale maintained a steady, quiet monologue, explaining what he was doing. It was an old habit from his medic days, meant to reassure patients even when they couldn't understand or respond. Whether it helped the Zealer or not, it kept his own hand steady and his mind focused on the present rather than the past. After about 10 minutes of careful work, the translator emitted a soft chime, indicating at least partial function had been restored. "Can you understand me now?" Kale asked, moving back to give her space. The Zealer's eyes widened slightly. "Yes." The word emerged slightly distorted but comprehensible. "You? Help me. Why?" It was a fair question, one Kale had been asking himself since he'd left his station. He shrugged. "Heard your call for help." Her expression shifted to surprise. "You heard me?" "Mentally. Something like that," Kale confirmed, turning to pack away his tools, uncomfortable with the implication that he might be psychically sensitive. "Doesn't matter. What matters is who's hunting you and why." Those weren't local security or even standard bounty hunters. Military-grade equipment, professional approach. "You're valuable to someone." The Zealer regarded him silently for a long moment, clearly weighing her options, calculating risks. Finally, she straightened slightly, a decision made. "My name is Lyra," she said, the translator rendering her words with an artificial precision that couldn't quite mask the underlying musical quality of her natural voice. "And those men want me because I stole something. Something they would kill to retrieve." Kale felt a headache forming behind his eyes. Of course it couldn't be simple. It never was. "Well, Lyra," he said, turning back to face her, "you'd better tell me exactly what you've gotten me into." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The night cycle of Xylos brought a different kind of danger. The bioluminescence intensified, turning the forest into a phantasmagoria of pulsing light that played tricks on the eyes. The nocturnal predators emerged, some silent, others filling the air with haunting calls that carried for kilometers. Inside Kale's station, the sound was muffled but still present, a constant reminder of the world beyond their temporary sanctuary. Lyra sat cross-legged on the bunk, cradling a container of nutrient-rich broth Kale had prepared. Her strength was returning slowly, the silver markings on her skin beginning to regain some of their luster. "The Institute seems innocent enough from the outside," she continued, her voice stronger now that the translator was functioning better. "A research facility dedicated to advancing biotechnology. They recruit from various species, seeking unique biological traits to study. My people, the Zealer, have natural empathic abilities and bioelectric systems that can interface with certain technologies. Valuable traits." Kale leaned against the small workspace that served as both desk and kitchen, arms crossed as he listened. "And they weren't satisfied with ethical research." Lyra's mouth twisted in a humorless smile. "Is anyone, when there's profit involved?" They began experimenting with enhancing our natural abilities, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Some of my people volunteered, believing the promises of advancing science, helping the galaxy. Others, like me, are acquired through less transparent means. "Kidnapped, Kale?" Translated flatly. She nodded. "My family believed I had been selected for a prestigious research position. By the time I understood what was happening, I was already deep within the facility, coded as Subject L7R. Her fingers touched the small device at her waist. A data drive, she had explained earlier. I was assigned to Dr. Severin's project. He was developing a way to weaponize our empathic abilities, to turn mental influence into something that could control rather than simply sense. Create perfect interrogators or the ultimate spies. The possibilities were extensive and valuable, Kale added, thinking of the resources devoted to recapturing her. Military applications. Corporate espionage. Exactly, Lyra confirmed. I discovered that Severin had already sold prototype technology to several interested parties, including a private military contractor. The final phase involved more invasive procedures, essentially turning subjects into living components of the technology. She took another sip of the broth, her hands steadier now. I knew I wouldn't survive the procedure, so I copied his research data and escaped during a systems maintenance cycle. I thought I could reach the authorities, expose what was happening. But Severin's influence is greater than I anticipated. The mercenaries found me before I could make contact. Kale processed the information, trying to assess their situation objectively. "How long have they been hunting you?" 16 days, Lyra answered, a note of weariness creeping into her voice. "I've been on Xylos for 9 of those. I thought the dangerous environment might deter them, or at least slow them down while I figured out my next move. Instead, it just isolated you further," Kale observed. "Makes you easier to capture without witnesses." Lyra's large eyes fixed on him with uncomfortable intensity. "You're military, aren't you? Or were? I can sense it in how you move, how you think." Kale stiffened, old reflexes warning him against revealing too much. But she had shared her story. Some reciprocity seemed fair. Former combat medic. Sergeant. Dishonorable discharge 5 years ago. What happened? The question was direct, without judgment. Kale turned away, moving to check the monitoring systems. An unnecessary action, but gave him something to do with his hands. Mission went wrong. Squad was ambushed. I was the only survivor. The words were clipped, rehearsed in their brevity. Failure to follow protocol. Failure to save lives. End of story. He could feel Lyra's gaze on his back. Knew that with her empathic abilities, she was likely sensing more than he was comfortable sharing. But she didn't press further. "We should rest," Kale said, changing the subject. "They'll be looking for us, but they'll be hampered by the night predators. We have a few hours at least." "And then what?" Lyra asked quietly. It was the question Kale had been avoiding. His isolation had been deliberate, a way to ensure he never again had to make decisions that might cost lives. Now, he was entangled in exactly the kind of situation he'd fled. "First priority is keeping you alive," he said finally. "After that, we'll figure out." The answer seemed to satisfy Lyra, or at least she recognized it was all he could offer at the moment. She settled back on the bunk, her movements still careful but more fluid than before. Cale took up position near the viewport, his rifle within easy reach. He didn't expect to sleep much, but even a combat veteran needed rest. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, the knowledge that someone else's life depended on his vigilance, his decisions. It should have felt oppressive. Instead, there was an odd comfort in the clarity of purpose. For the first time in 5 years, the ghosts of his fallen comrades seemed quieter, as if approving of his decision to help Lyra. Or perhaps it was simply that focused on current dangers, there was less room for old regrets. Whatever the reason, as Cale settled into the watchful half-sleep he perfected during his military years, one thought persisted. Somewhere in the dense forest below, hunters were planning their next move. And come morning, the real test would begin. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Dawn on Xylos wasn't the dramatic affair, it was on other worlds. The twin suns simply asserted themselves gradually through the thick canopy, turning the perpetual twilight marginally brighter. Cale, who had dozed fitfully throughout the night, straightened as the ambient light shifted, signaling the change of cycle. A soft sound behind him indicated Lyra was awake as well. She moved to join him at the viewport, her movements more fluid after rest and treatment. The silver patterns on her skin were brighter now, creating intricate designs that seemed to shift subtly as she moved. "Your markings," Cale noted, "they're biotech, aren't they? Not just decorative." Lyra nodded. "They enhance our natural abilities, help regulate our energy systems. All Zealer have them from birth, though they develop fully during adolescence." Her fingers traced one of the patterns absently. The Institute was particularly interested in them, wanted to know if the technology could be replicated, adapted for other species. Cale's monitoring system emitted a soft alert, drawing his attention. A proximity warning. Something was approaching his security perimeter. "We've got company," he said, moving to the small console. The readings showed multiple heat signatures converging on the station, moving with the coordinated precision of trained operatives. At least 6 of them, well-equipped. Lyra joined him in the console, her expression grim. "They've called in reinforcements. Severin must be more desperate than I thought." Cale quickly assessed their options. His station wasn't designed as a fortress. It was a hiding place, relying more on secrecy than defensibility. Against a determined attack by professional mercenaries, it wouldn't hold for long. "We need to fortify what we can and prepare an escape route," he decided, already moving to gather essential supplies. "They'll try to take you alive, which gives us some advantage. They have to be careful." "And you?" Lyra asked, helping him collect medical supplies and emergency rations. "They have no reason to show restraint with you." Cale gave her a grim smile. "I'm counting on them being efficient, not vindictive. Eliminating me is secondary to capturing you. They'll try to neutralize me quickly, not waste time on unnecessary violence." He paused, considering. Unless Severin specifically ordered otherwise. Lyra's expression darkened. "He's not a man who tolerates interference. If he gave specific instructions about you, they won't be merciful." A more urgent alert sounded from the console. The mercenaries had split into 2 groups, approaching from different angles. "They're being cautious," Cale observed, moving to activate the station's modest defensive measures, mostly early warning systems and a few deterrents designed for wildlife rather than armed attackers. "Good. That buys us time." He handed Lyra a small pack containing essential supplies. "There's an emergency exit through the maintenance shaft. Leads to a platform on the far side of the tree. I have a zip line system that can get you to the ground quickly." Lyra accepted the pack, but frowned. "You're coming too. Right behind you," Cale assured her, checking his rifle's charge. "But someone needs to slow them down first." Before Lyra could protest, a sharp crack echoed through the station as something struck the outer hull. The viewport crystallized with a spiderweb of fractures where a projectile had hit it. Not powerful enough to penetrate immediately, but designed to weaken the structure. "They're testing our defenses," Kale said, moving away from the damaged section. "Go. Now. I'll be right behind you." This time Lyra didn't argue. She moved to the narrow maintenance shaft at the back of the station, pausing only briefly at the entrance. "Be careful," she said, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that suggested she was using her empathic abilities to convey more than words could. Kale felt a strange warmth flutter through his mind, concern, gratitude, and something less definable. Then she was gone, squeezing through the tight passage. Alone, Kale moved quickly to implement his hastily formed plan. He set several of his monitoring devices to emit false life signs, positioned to make it appear that both he and Lyra were still in the main area of the station. Then he activated a cascade failure in the station's power systems. Not enough to shut down completely, but enough to create sporadic electrical discharges that would make entering dangerous. As he worked, a mechanical whirring sound from outside indicated the mercenaries were deploying some kind of device. Seconds later, the station shuddered as small cutting tools began working on the exterior hull. They were creating entry points. Kale grabbed his rifle and a few last supplies, then headed for the maintenance shaft. Just before entering, he triggered the final part of his plan, a controlled release of the station's atmospheric regulation chemicals. In the confined space, the combination would create a dense, caustic fog that would severely hamper visibility and irritate exposed skin and eyes. Not lethal, but definitely unpleasant. The maintenance shaft was barely wide enough for Kale's shoulders, forcing him to wriggle through like a snake. He could hear Lyra ahead of him, moving more easily with her slider build. Behind them, the sound of the hull being breached was followed by shouts of surprise as the mercenaries encountered the chemical fog. The shaft opened onto a small platform Kale had built for maintenance access, partially concealed by the dense foliage of the massive tree. Lyra was already there, scanning the forest below for threats. "The zip line is there," Kale said, pointing to a nearly invisible cable that extended from the platform to a point some 100 meters away, where another massive tree provided an anchor. "It'll get us to the ground, but we'll still be within their search perimeter." Lyra nodded, already securing the harness attached to the line. "We can use the forest to our advantage. I've been observing the patterns of the predators, the dangerous areas. I can guide us through." An explosion rocked the station behind them, sending vibrations through the tree. The mercenaries were done with subtlety. "Time to go," Kale said, helping Lyra finalize the harness connections. "Remember, when you land, release immediately and move to cover. I'll be right behind you." Lyra hesitated, her hand on his arm. "Why are you risking so much for me? You don't know me. This isn't your fight." It was a question Kale had been asking himself since he'd first detected her distress call. The answer that came to him wasn't one he'd expected. "Maybe I'm tired of running from fights that matter," he said simply. "Now go." Lyra held his gaze for a moment longer, then pushed off from the platform, the zip line carrying her swiftly and silently away from the station. Kale watched until she landed safely, disappearing into the undergrowth as instructed. He was securing his own harness when the maintenance hatch behind him burst open. A mercenary in full combat gear emerged, weapon raised. Kale didn't hesitate. He fired 2 quick shots from his rifle, forcing the mercenary to duck back into the shaft, then launched himself off the platform. The zip line sang with tension as it carried him away from the station and the pursuing mercenaries. Wind rushed past his face, the forest a blur of color below. For a brief moment, there was an exhilarating freedom in the flight, a reminder of simpler joys long forgotten. Then reality reasserted itself in the form of weapons fire. The mercenaries had emerged onto the platform and were firing at his retreating figure. Most shots went wide, but one struck the zip line just behind him, sending dangerous vibrations through the cable. Kale increased his speed, using gravity to propel him faster toward the landing point. He could see Lyra waiting at the edge of the clearing, concern evident even at a distance. The cable gave a warning groan as the damaged section began to fail. Cale was still 20 meters from the landing point when it snapped. For a sickening moment, he was in free fall, the forest floor rushing up to meet him. Then he hit the dense foliage of a lower branch, the impact driving the air from his lungs, but breaking his fall enough that when he finally struck the ground, it wasn't fatal. Pain lanced through his left shoulder and side. Something was definitely broken, possibly several somethings. But he was alive, and the thick undergrowth had concealed his landing spot from the mercenaries above. Lyra appeared beside him, moving with the silent grace of her species. Without words, she helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as they moved deeper into the forest. Cale bit back groans of pain, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. "We need to find cover," he managed between careful breaths. "Assess damage. Make a plan." Lyra nodded, guiding them through the dense vegetation with surprising confidence. "There's a rock formation not far from here. Creates a natural shelter. The local predators avoid it because of the mineral composition." They moved as quickly as Cale's injuries would allow, alert for signs of pursuit. The mercenaries would have to descend from the tree more carefully, giving them a small lead, but it wouldn't last long. Professionals like that would have contingency plans for every scenario. The rock formation Lyra had mentioned appeared after about 15 minutes of difficult travel, a jumble of massive boulders that had been forced up through the forest floor by some ancient geological activity. They resembled a giant's scattered playthings, creating natural crevices and caves. Lyra led him to a narrow opening between two boulders, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. Inside, the space opened up into a small chamber, large enough for them to sit comfortably but not stand. Light filtered in through cracks in the rock ceiling, providing just enough illumination to see. "How did you know about this place?" Cale asked as Lyra helped him sit against the smoothest section of wall. "I spent 9 days in this forest before they caught me," she reminded him, already examining his injuries with gentle fingers. "I learned to find safe spaces quickly." The assessment was sobering. Cale had 3 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and numerous cuts and contusions. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but enough to severely limit his mobility and effectiveness in a fight. With Lyra's help, he managed to reset his shoulder, a white-hot explosion of pain, followed by the relief of proper alignment. The ribs would have to heal on their own, but he had compression bandages in his pack that would stabilize them enough for movement. "Your medical skills are impressive," Lyra observed as she helped wrap the bandages around his torso, her movements careful but efficient. "Combat medic," Cale reminded her through gritted teeth. "Got plenty of practice in the field." Lyra's fingers paused briefly on one of the older scars that marked his skin, a jagged line across his abdomen that had clearly been a life-threatening wound at one time. She didn't comment on it, but Cale felt a gentle brush against his mind, an empathic connection that conveyed understanding without words. Once his injuries were stabilized, they took stock of their situation. The pack Cale had given Lyra contained emergency rations, a water purifier, basic medical supplies, and a small multi-tool. His own pack, miraculously still with him after the fall, held his portable scanner, additional ammunition for the rifle, and a few specialized tools from his military days. "They'll have tracking equipment," Cale said, trying to think like the hunters. "Standard procedure would be to establish a search grid centered on my station, then methodically sweep outward. With 6 of them, they can cover a lot of ground quickly. They'll also have biological scanners calibrated to my specific energy signature," Lyra added. Her fingers went to the silver markings on her skin. "These aren't just passive patterns. They're part of what makes me traceable." Cale frowned, considering this new complication. "Can you suppress them somehow? Mask the signature?" Lyra nodded slowly. "Temporarily, yes. It's a meditative technique my people use for deep healing. But it's difficult to maintain while moving, and it will limit my other abilities, including the empathic senses that might warn us of approaching danger. A difficult trade-off, but a necessary one." "Do what you can," Cale said. "We need to get beyond their search perimeter, find a way off this moon." "The research station," Lyra suggested. "They must have communication equipment. possibly even a shuttle. Kale shook his head grimly. Bad idea. First place they'd look for us, and the researchers there have no reason to help fugitives. For all we know, they're already cooperating with your pursuers. Then what's your suggestion? There was no challenge in her tone, just genuine inquiry. Kale was silent for a moment, weighing their limited options. Finally, he said, there's an abandoned mining outpost about 15 kilometers north of here. Corporation pulled out 3 years ago when the ore deposits proved less valuable than expected. They left some equipment behind, including a long-range communicator. If it's still functional, we might be able to call for help. 15 kilometers through this forest, with you injured and them hunting us, Lyra summarized, her expression grave. Not ideal odds. Kale managed a pained smile. Never tell me the odds. Makes things too depressing. Despite the dire circumstances, Lyra returned the smile, a brief flash of warmth in her otherwise wary expression. It transformed her features, making her seem younger, less haunted. Rest for an hour, she said, her decision apparently made. I'll keep watch and prepare myself for the journey. We'll leave when the light begins to fade. The transition to night cycle will provide additional cover. Kale wanted to argue. Sitting still made him an easy target, but his body's protests were becoming harder to ignore. The adrenaline that had carried him this far was wearing off, leaving bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. 1 hour, he conceded, adjusting his position to find the least painful way to sit. Then we move, no matter what. Lyra nodded and moved to the entrance of their small shelter, positioning herself where she could watch for threats while remaining hidden from outside view. Her posture was alert but relaxed, suggesting she was beginning the meditative process she'd mentioned. Kale allowed his eyes to close, not quite surrendering to sleep, but letting his body gather what strength it could. In the dim quiet of their rocky shelter, he found himself oddly conscious of Lyra's presence. Not just physically, but a subtle awareness of her at the edges of his mind. Perhaps it was her empathic abilities reaching out instinctively, or perhaps it was simply that for the first time in 5 years, he wasn't completely alone. Whatever the reason, as Kale drifted in the borderlands of consciousness, one unexpected thought surfaced. Despite the danger, despite the pain, there was something strangely right about this moment, as if he'd been waiting for it without knowing. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. They left the shelter as the light began to wane, moving through the forest with as much speed and stealth as Kale's injuries would allow. Lyra led the way, her knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable as she guided them along routes that minimized exposure while avoiding the most dangerous areas of the forest. Her silver markings had dimmed significantly, a result of the meditative techniques she was employing to mask her energy signature. The effort was clearly taxing. Occasionally she would pause, eyes closed, breathing deliberately as she reinforced her mental control. Kale followed in pained silence, each step sending jolts of discomfort through his injured ribs. He'd refused additional painkillers, needing the clarity of mind that pain provided. Dulled senses could get them both killed. They spoke little as they traveled, conserving energy and minimizing noise. The forest around them grew more active as night approached, the bioluminescent flora intensifying their glow, creating an ethereal landscape of blue-green light. The natural beauty might have been captivating under different circumstances. After about 2 hours of careful progress, Lyra held up a hand, signaling Kale to stop. She stood perfectly still, head tilted slightly, as if listening to something beyond normal hearing range. "What is it?" Kale whispered, rifle ready despite the agony it caused his ribs to lift the weapon. "They've changed their search pattern," Lyra replied, her voice equally soft. "I can sense them." Shifting direction, moving to intercept. Kale frowned. "Ow! If you're masking your signature, they must have other means of tracking," Lyra said, her expression troubled. "Perhaps residual energy traces from the station, or—" Her eyes widened with sudden realization. The data drive. Of course. Her hand went to the small device secured at her waist, the stolen research that had started this chase. Severin's work involves energy manipulation at its core, she explained quickly. The data itself, might be emitting a unique signature. I didn't consider that possibility. Kale processed this new complication. Can you block it the same way you're suppressing your own signature? Lyra shook her head. Different type of energy. My techniques won't affect it. She hesitated, then added reluctantly, we could leave it behind. Create a false trail. The suggestion clearly pained her. Abandoning the evidence that might expose the Institute's unethical research would mean her suffering and escape had been for nothing. Kale considered their options. How far ahead of them are we? Perhaps 30 minutes, but they're moving faster than we are. A decision had to be made. Kale gestured to a massive fallen tree nearby, creating a natural bridge across a small ravine. We need to cross that. On the other side, find somewhere defensible, somewhere with limited approaches. Lyra's eyes widened with understanding. You want to confront them. Not all of them, Kale clarified. But we need to reduce their numbers, create confusion. Right now, they're hunting us methodically. We need to change that dynamic. It was a risky strategy, especially given his injured state, but continuing to flee would only end with them being run to ground. Better to take some control of the situation while they still could. Lyra studied him for a moment, then nodded decisively. I know a place. About half a kilometer beyond the ravine, there's a clearing surrounded by pitcher plants, massive ones. They secrete a digestive enzyme that most predators avoid. Only 2 safe approaches. Perfect, Kale said, impressed by her observational skills. Lead the way. They crossed the fallen tree carefully, the chasm below dropping at least 30 meters to a bed of jagged rocks. On the other side, Lyra guided them through increasingly dense vegetation until they reached the clearing she described. It was smaller than Kale had expected, perhaps 15 meters in diameter, surrounded by enormous carnivorous plants that resembled ancient pitchers filled with viscous fluid. The plants emitted a sickly sweet odor that made his stomach turn, but they created a natural barrier that would force their pursuers to use the only safe pathways in, exactly as Lyra had described. They'll approach from there, Lyra said, pointing to a narrow gap between 2 of the massive plants. It's the only logical entry point from the direction they're coming. Kale nodded, already formulating a plan. I need you to hide there, he said, indicating a dense patch of phosphorescent ferns near the opposite edge of the clearing. Stay low. Keep the data drive with you. I'll position myself here. He moved to a fallen log that provided both cover and a clear line of sight to the expected entry point. Setting up the rifle, he then removed several small devices from his pack, compact, disc-shaped objects that pulsed with a soft blue light when activated. Sonic disruptors, he explained, seeing Lyra's questioning look. Military issue. Short range, but effective. They'll disorient anyone within a 5-meter radius. Mess with inner ear function, cause temporary blindness. I'll place them along. Their likely approach. What exactly is your plan? Lyra asked, watching as he carefully positioned the first device. Kale's expression was grim. They're professionals, which means they'll send scouts ahead of the main group. 2, maybe 3. When they enter the clearing, I trigger the disruptors. In the confusion, I take them out, non-lethally if possible. We use their comm equipment to feed false information back to the others, redirect their search away from us. It wasn't an elegant plan, but with limited resources and his injured state, it was the best he could devise. Lyra seemed to understand this, offering no criticism as she helped him position the remaining disruptors. What if more than the scouts come? She asked as they finished. Then we improvise, Kale replied with a tight smile. Something I used to be good at, back before I decided isolation was the answer to everything. Lyra touched his arm briefly, the contact sending a strange warmth through him despite the gravity of their situation. Thank you, she said simply, for all of this. Before Kale could respond, she moved to the hiding spot he'd indicated, disappearing into the luminous ferns with the natural stealth of her species. Left alone, Kale settled into position behind the log, fighting through the pain to focus his mind on the task ahead. The wait was nerve-wracking. Every sound from the forest seemed magnified. The distant calls of nocturnal creatures, the rustle of vegetation in the light breeze, the occasional plop as one of the pitcher plants digested an unfortunate insect. Kale regulated his breathing, falling back on old training to keep his mind sharp despite the discomfort of his injuries. The attack, when it came, was almost silent. The first indication was the slightest disturbance in the pattern of forest sounds, a momentary hush, as if the wildlife sensed the approaching predators. Kale tensed, finger hovering near the trigger of the disruptor control. Two figures emerged from the gap between the pitcher plants, moving with the practiced caution of experienced operatives. Their exoskeletons were sleeker than those Kale had observed earlier, designed for stealth rather than raw power. Each carried a compact pulse rifle and what appeared to be specialized scanning equipment. Kale waited until they were fully in the clearing, allowing them to advance to the optimal position for the disruptor's effect. They moved in standard sweep formation, one slightly ahead and to the left, the other covering the right flank, both scanning for threats. When they reached the center of the clearing, Kale activated the disruptors. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Both mercenaries staggered as the sonic pulse hit them, their coordination shattered by the assault on their senses. One dropped to his knees, hands going to his helmet in a futile attempt to block the debilitating sound. The other managed to remain standing, but was clearly disoriented, weapon wavering as he tried to identify the source of the attack. Kale moved quickly, ignoring the screaming protest from his ribs. He targeted the standing mercenary first, firing two quick, controlled bursts from his rifle. The first struck the man's weapon, rendering it useless. The second hit his exoskeleton's power junction, causing it to sputter and lock up, effectively immobilizing him. The kneeling mercenary had recovered enough to reach for a secondary weapon. Kale adjusted his aim and fired again, this shot more precise, striking the man's hand. It wasn't a lethal hit, but it was enough to send the weapon spinning away and force a cry of pain that confirmed these weren't droids or fully armored troops. In less than 20 seconds, both scouts were neutralized. Kale approached cautiously, rifle trained on them, aware that even disabled professional operatives like these could be dangerous. Communication devices, he demanded, voice hard. Slowly, the standing mercenary, still fighting the effects of the sonic disruption, glared at Kale through his visor. "You're making a mistake," he managed, voice slightly slurred. "You have no idea what you're interfering with." "I know enough," Kale responded, gesturing with his rifle. "Comms. Now." The mercenary hesitated, then slowly reached for a device at his belt. Kale tensed, ready for deception, but the man simply removed a small communicator and tossed it to the ground between them. The second mercenary, clutching his injured hand, followed suit with a bitter curse. Kale retrieved both devices while keeping his rifle trained on the pair. Standard military-grade communicators, likely encrypted, but not impossible to use for basic deception. "Armor off," he ordered next. "Slowly, one piece at a time." "You won't get away with this," the second mercenary said, but complied, beginning to disengage his exoskeleton. "Severin has resources you can't imagine. The whole sector is looking for the Zealer and what she stole." Kale didn't respond to the attempted intimidation. Once both mercenaries were divested of their armor and additional weapons, he used restraints from their own equipment to secure them to one of the smaller trees at the edge of the clearing. "Lyra," he called softly. She emerged from her hiding place, moving with a fluid grace that seemed characteristic of her species, even under stress. The mercenaries' eyes widened at the sight of her, confirmation that she was indeed their primary target. "Can you use the communicator?" Kale asked, handing her one of the devices. "Send a message that will redirect the others?" Lyra examined the communicator, her expression thoughtful. "Yes, these are standard Institute equipment. I know the protocols." She looked up at the captured mercenaries, a hint of her former clinical detachment returning. "I'll also be able to extract useful information from the device's logs, their full search pattern, coordination points, perhaps even their extraction plan." She set to work immediately, fingers moving with practiced efficiency over the communicator's interface. Meanwhile, Kale approached the captives, studying them more carefully now that the immediate threat was neutralized. They were human or near human, experienced soldiers by their bearing, with the hardened expressions of men who had seen considerable combat. The insignia on their underarmor was unfamiliar to Cale, not matching any of the standard private military contractors he'd encountered during his service. "Who are you working for?" he asked directly. "Specifically." The older of the two mercenaries gave a short, humorless laugh. "Above your clearance level, friend. But I'll give you some free advice. Walk away now. Leave the asset, and we might forget your interference." "The asset has a name," Cale said coldly. "And she's not going back to be dissected for someone's profit." The younger mercenary spoke up, his voice tinged with what sounded almost like sincerity. "You don't understand what's at stake. The research she stole, it's not just about weapons or espionage. It's about security for entire systems. The ability to detect threats before they materialize, to prevent wars before they start. By turning sentient beings into tools," Lyra interjected, looking up from the communicator. "By violating everything that makes us who we are." Her eyes, luminous in the growing darkness, fixed on the mercenary with surprising compassion. "They told you it was for the greater good, didn't they? Made you believe you were protecting people." Something flickered in the young mercenary's expression. Doubt, perhaps, or recognition of a truth he'd been avoiding. The older one noticed and scowled. "Don't listen to it," he snapped. "Remember your training. They're manipulative by nature. It's what makes the text so valuable." Cale watched the interaction with interest. There was division here, uncertainty that might be useful. But before he could pursue it further, Lyra approached with the communicator. "I've sent a message," she said quietly. "Made it appear that they detected trace signatures heading toward the southern ravines, opposite our actual destination. It should buy us several hours at least." She handed Cale the device. "I also found this. Their extraction plan." Cale examined the information on the small screen. The mercenaries had a shuttle waiting at a designated point approximately 20 kilometers east of their current position. It was scheduled to remain for 48 more hours before departing, with or without the target. "We have a new destination," he said, a plan forming. "If we can reach their shuttle, we can get off-world." The older mercenary's expression confirmed the information was legitimate, and that Cale's plan was a genuine threat to their mission. "You'll never make it," he said, strain evident in his voice. "The rest of my team will figure out your deception soon enough. And even if you somehow reach the shuttle, you won't be able to fly it. The systems are biolocked to our team." Lyra's expression suggested otherwise. "The Institute designed those locks. I helped implement some of them during my time there." Her voice held a mixture of bitterness and determination. "I can bypass them." Hope, an unfamiliar sensation after years of resigned isolation, flared in Cale's chest. They had a plan now, difficult, dangerous, but possible. Away off this moon and away from their pursuers. "We need to move," he said, gathering the useful equipment from the mercenaries' discarded gear. "The longer we stay here, the more likely their friends will get suspicious." Lyra nodded, but hesitated, looking at the restrained men. What about them? It was a fair question, and one without easy answers. Leaving them secured, as they were, would likely mean death, if not from the predators of Xylos, then from exposure or dehydration. Cale considered his options, the combat veteran in him calculating the threat they posed against the moral implications of leaving them to die. Finally, he made his decision. "We leave them with water and a single knife," he said, retrieving both items from the captured supplies. "Enough to give them a chance to free themselves, but not quickly enough to pursue us immediately." He placed the canteen and knife just within reach of a younger mercenary, the one who had shown a flicker of doubt. A calculated choice that might further the division within their ranks. "This isn't over," the older mercenary warned as Cale and Lyra prepared to depart. "Severin won't stop. The data she stole, he'll burn worlds to get it back." Cale met the man's gaze steadily. "Then I guess we'd better make sure he doesn't." With that, he and Lyra left the clearing, heading east toward the extraction point and their best hope of escape. Behind them, The bioluminescent forest seemed to close ranks, swallowing their retreating figures in a sea of ethereal light. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The journey toward the extraction point was a grueling test of endurance. Kale's injuries, temporarily forgotten in the adrenaline of combat, reasserted themselves with vindictive force as they pushed through the dense vegetation. Each breath was a negotiation with pain, each step a battle against mounting fatigue. Lyra maintained her energy-masking meditation as they traveled, though the effort was clearly taking a toll. The silver markings on her skin fluctuated in brightness, occasionally flaring when her concentration slipped before dimming again as she regained control. They moved primarily in silence, conserving strength and remaining alert for signs of pursuit. The night's cycle of xylos deepened around them, the bioluminescent flora providing just enough light to navigate by while offering the concealment of shadows. After approximately 4 hours of steady progress, they reached the edge of a massive clearing, an unnatural gap in the forest where the trees had been systematically removed. In the center sat a small but well-equipped research station, lights glowing from several windows, a communications array perched on its roof like a metallic crown. "We need to go around," Kale said, studying the facility with professional wariness. "Too exposed to cross directly." Lyra nodded, but her attention seemed fixed on the station itself. "That's a NovaCorp research outpost," she observed. "Specialized xenobiology focus, if the equipment configuration is standard." Kale glanced at her. "You recognize it?" "The Institute had partnerships with most of the major research corporations," she explained. "We received equipment, funding, test subjects sometimes, in exchange for privileged access to our findings." There was a bitter edge to her voice, a reminder of her own exploitation within that system. "All the more reason to avoid it," Kale said. "If they have ties to the Institute, they might be obligated to report sightings." They skirted the clearing, keeping to the densest sections of forest despite the slower progress it necessitated. Once past the station's immediate vicinity, they continued eastward, guided by the coordinates extracted from the mercenaries' communicator. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the perpetual twilight of Xylos, they found themselves approaching a different kind of clearing, a natural formation where the ground rose to form a rocky plateau, mostly clear of the massive trees that dominated the rest of the landscape. According to the extracted data, the mercenary shuttle should be waiting there, hidden by terrain rather than foliage, its systems in standby mode to minimize detection. Kale and Lyra paused at the forest's edge, surveying the open ground that separated them from their target. The shuttle was indeed there, a sleek, mid-sized craft designed for speed and stealth rather than comfort or capacity. Its matte black hull absorbed light rather than reflecting it, making it difficult to focus on directly. "No visible guards," Kale noted, scanning the area carefully. "But that doesn't mean it's unprotected. Standard procedure would be automated defense systems, proximity alarms." Lyra studied the craft, her expression thoughtful. "I can sense some active systems, a perimeter monitoring grid, most likely, calibrated to the team's specific biorhythms." She looked at Kale. "Any unauthorized approach would trigger countermeasures. Can you bypass it?" Kale asked. "Like you said you could with the biolocks?" Lyra hesitated. "Possibly, but I would need to be closer within the outer boundary of the field, and maintaining my energy suppression while attempting to manipulate their systems would be challenging." It was a diplomatic way of saying she would have to lower her defenses, making herself detectable again. A significant risk, but unavoidable if they wanted to reach the shuttle. "How close?" Kale asked, already scanning for the approach that would offer maximum cover. "Within 50 meters," Lyra replied. "Any farther, and the interference would be too great." Kale considered their options. The most direct path would leave them exposed for nearly 100 meters. However, a dry stream bed cut across one corner of the clearing, potentially offering some concealment for at least part of the approach. "We'll use that," he decided, indicating the natural depression. "It'll get us to about 60 meters from the shuttle." "Close enough." Lyra studied the stream bed, then nodded. "It should be sufficient." But once I begin to work on their systems, I'll be vulnerable. My concentration will be focused on the task. The implication was clear. Kale would need to protect her during that critical phase. Despite his injuries, despite his exhaustion, he would need to be her shield one more time. I understand, he said simply. Let's move. We need to reach the shuttle and be gone before the search team realizes they've been misdirected. They made their way carefully to the stream bed, then used its meager shelter to approach the shuttle. The dry channel was shallow, barely deep enough to conceal them when crouching, but it was better than crossing completely exposed. When they reached the point Lyra had indicated, approximately 50 meters from the shuttle, they paused. Kale positioned himself where he could watch both the forest behind them and the shuttle ahead, rifle ready despite the pain it caused his injured ribs. "I'm ready when you are," he said quietly. Lyra took a deep breath, centering herself. "This will take several minutes. The security systems are intricate. Take the time you need," Kale assured her. "Just tell me what to expect when you start. When I release my energy suppression, there will be a surge, like a flare visible to anyone scanning for my signature. It won't last long, but it will be unmistakable if they're looking in the right direction." Her eyes met his, concern evident. "And I'll need to maintain physical contact with this." She removed the data drive from its secure pouch, the stolen research that had started this whole chase. It was smaller than Kale had expected, a sleek cylinder no larger than his thumb, covered in intricate circuitry. "It contains access protocols I need," Lyra explained, seeing his questioning look. "Part of why it's so valuable. Not just the research itself, but the encryption keys, the backdoor access to Institute systems." Kale nodded his understanding. "Do what you need to do. I'll keep watch." Lyra settled into a cross-legged position, the data drive held between her palms. She closed her eyes, her breathing slowing to a measured rhythm. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the silver markings on her skin began to glow, slowly at first, then with increasing brightness until they illuminated her entire form with an ethereal radiance. Kale felt a subtle pressure in his mind. Not intrusive, but like the awareness of a change in atmosphere pressure before a storm. Lyra's empathic abilities, no longer suppressed, were radiating outward, connecting with the systems of the shuttle. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. Kale divided his attention between watching Lyra and scanning their surroundings, alert for any sign of discovery or pursuit. The forest remained quiet, the clearing empty save for them and the waiting shuttle. Just as Kale was beginning to hope they might succeed without complication, a faint sound from the forest edge caught his attention. The subtle disturbance of vegetation that indicated movement too deliberate to be wildlife. "We've got company," he whispered, shifting to a better firing position while keeping his profile low. "How much longer?" Lyra didn't open her eyes, though a frown of concentration deepened on her face. "Nearly there," she murmured. "The outer perimeter is down, but the biolocks are more complex than I expected. A few more minutes." Kale assessed their situation with a rapid calculation of combat experience. The approaching threat was still at the forest's edge, moving cautiously, likely having detected Lyra's energy signature but unsure of its exact location. They had a small window before discovery became inevitable. "Keep working," he said quietly. "I'll buy us some time." Before Lyra could respond, Kale was moving, staying low in the stream bed until he reached a point where it curved back toward the forest. Using the natural cover, he circled around to approach the threat from an angle, hoping to draw attention away from Lyra's position. As he neared the forest edge, he could make out two figures, more mercenaries from the same team, moving with the coordinated precision of trained operatives. They had detected something but weren't yet certain of what they were tracking, their movements betraying caution rather than confidence. Kale needed to create a distraction, something to focus their attention away from the stream bed where Lyra worked. Drawing on decades-old training, he selected A, target about 30 meters to the right of the mercenary's position, and fired a single shot. The pulse rifle's discharge illuminated the dawnlit clearing briefly, the energy bolt striking a rock formation with a shower of sparks. Instantly, both mercenaries turned toward the apparent threat, weapons raised, moving to flank what they presumed was their target's position. Kale fired again, this time from a slightly different angle, creating the impression of movement. The mercenaries responded with suppressive fire, energy bolts cutting through the vegetation where they believed the threat was located. The diversion was working, but Kale knew it wouldn't last long. Professional operators like these would quickly realize they were being led away from the real target. He needed to maintain the deception just long enough for Lyra to complete her work with the shuttle systems. He was preparing to create a third diversion when a new sound cut through the air, the distinctive hum of a shuttle's engines initializing. The mercenaries heard it too, their attention immediately shifting to the craft sitting in the center of the clearing. Lyra had succeeded in bypassing the security systems. The mercenaries abandoned their cautious approach, breaking cover to sprint toward the shuttle. Kale emerged from his position, firing controlled bursts to force them back into the tree line. He was at a disadvantage, 2 against 1, with his injuries hampering his mobility, but he only needed to delay them, not defeat them outright. Kale! Lyra's voice carried from the direction of the shuttle. It's ready. We have to go now. He fired one final volley to keep the mercenaries suppressed, then turned and ran toward the shuttle, pain lancing through his side with each impact of his feet on the hard ground. The shuttle's hatch was open, the entry ramp deployed, Lyra visible in the opening, gesturing urgently. The mercenaries recovered quickly, emerging from cover to fire at his retreating form. Energy bolts sizzled past him, one close enough that he felt the heat against his cheek. Kale didn't slow, didn't look back, focused entirely on reaching the shuttle before either a lucky shot found him or more of the team arrived. He reached the ramp just as the shuttle's defensive systems came online, presumably Lyra's doing. A shimmering energy field expanded outward from the hull, deflecting the incoming fire. Kale staggered up the ramp, gasping with pain and exertion, and collapsed into the shuttle's cargo bay. Lyra was already at the controls, the silver markings on her skin pulsing with light as she interfaced directly with the shuttle systems. The hatch closed behind Kale with a pneumatic hiss, the ramp retracting as the engines rose from standby to full power. Strap in, Lyra called over her shoulder, her fingers dancing across the control panel with practiced ease. This will not be a gentle departure. Kale dragged himself to the nearest seat, securing the harness just as the shuttle lifted off with a lurch that sent fresh pain shooting through his ribs. Through the viewports, he could see the mercenaries continuing to fire uselessly at the energy-shielded hull. The shuttle rose rapidly, its powerful engines driving it upward with acceleration that pressed Kale back into his seat. The verdant canopy of xylos fell away beneath them, the bioluminescent forest shrinking to a glowing carpet, then to a distant patchwork as they broke through the upper atmosphere. In less than a minute, they were in space, the curve of the moon visible below, the gas giant it orbited dominating the viewport. Lyra adjusted their course, plotting a trajectory that would take them away from the Xylos system and toward the nearest major transit hub. Only when they were safely away, the navigation locked in and the autopilot engaged, did she come to join Kale in the passenger compartment. "Are you all right?" she asked, concern evident as she took in his exhausted, pain-etched expression. Kale managed a tired smile. "Been better. Been worse, too." He shifted slightly, wincing as his ribs protested. "You got us out. That's what matters." Lyra retrieved a medkit from the shuttle storage compartment and began treating his injuries more thoroughly than had been possible in the forest. Her touch was gentle but confident, suggesting she had medical training beyond mere first aid. "The shuttle has limited medical supplies, but enough to stabilize you until we reach civilization," she said as she worked. "The autopilot is set for the Helios transit hub. We should arrive in approximately 48 hours. Kale nodded, the adrenaline of their escape finally wearing off, leaving him drained. And then what? It was the question that had been hovering between them, unspoken but inevitable. Once they reached the hub, what would happen? Would they go their separate ways? Continue together? And to what end? Lyra paused in her ministrations, her large, expressive eyes meeting his. "I still need to get this data to the authorities," she said, indicating the drive now secured once more at her waist. The evidence of what the Institute is doing, it needs to be exposed. But Severin's influence is substantial. It won't be easy or safe. Nothing worth doing ever is, Cale observed quietly. He reached out, hesitantly at first, then with more certainty, to cover her hand with his. You don't have to do it alone. The offer hung between them, unexpected yet somehow inevitable. Lyra looked at their joined hands, then back to his face, searching for something in his expression. You've already risked so much, she said softly. Your home, your safety. I can't ask you to continue putting yourself in danger for a cause that isn't yours. Maybe I'm tired of not having a cause, Cale replied, surprising himself with the truth of the words. 5 years hiding from the world from myself. From what happened? He took a deep breath, wincing at the pain in his ribs. Maybe it's time I stopped running. A gentle sensation brushed against his mind. Lyra's empathic abilities reaching out, not invasively, but offering connection, understanding. In that moment of shared consciousness, Cale felt her gratitude, her hope, but also her fear, not for herself, but for him. It won't be easy, she warned, though he sensed a resolve wavering. Severin won't stop. The Institute has connections throughout the sector. We'll be fugitives. Cale managed a pained smile. I've been living as a hermit on a death world for 5 years. Being a fugitive with actual company might be an improvement. That drew a surprised laugh from Lyra, a musical sound that transformed her serious features, revealing a glimpse of who she might have been before the Institute, before becoming a subject rather than a person. Then we do this together, she said, a decision reached. Her fingers turned to intertwine with his, the silver markings on her skin glowing softly with what Cale somehow knew was contentment rather than distress. As exhaustion finally claimed him, pulling him toward healing sleep, Cale's last conscious thought was that for the first time since Tacitus' prime, the ghosts of his fallen comrades seemed at peace. Perhaps they'd simply been waiting for him to find his way back to purpose, to connection, to saving who he could. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The Helios Transit Hub was a sprawling complex of interconnected stations orbiting a nondescript star at the junction of 3 major trade routes. Its neutrality was fiercely protected by an independent security force, making it as close to safe harbor as fugitives like Cale and Lyra could hope for, at least temporarily. They docked the stolen shuttle at an automated berth in one of the outlying arms of the hub, far from the central administrative sections where security was heaviest. Using the mercenaries' credit access, another piece of valuable information Lyra had extracted from their communication system, they booked private quarters in a mid-level residential section frequented by long-haul traders and itinerant workers. The small suite was luxurious compared to Cale's station on Xylos, though modest by station standards. 2 sleeping alcoves, a common area with basic cooking facilities, and a refresher unit with actual water options rather than just sauna cleaning. We should be able to stay here for a few days without attracting attention, Cale said, examining the security features of their temporary home. His injuries were healing well after proper treatment in the shuttle's medical bay, though the ribs would take time to mend completely. That gives us time to plan our next move. Lyra nodded, though her attention seemed focused on the data drive she'd set on the small table between them. In the harsh, artificial lighting of the station, the silver markings on her skin appeared muted, subdued to match her understated civilian clothing, part of their effort to blend in with the hub's diverse population. The evidence needs to reach someone with enough authority to act on it, but independent enough not to be under the Institute's influence, she said, the problem that had occupied much of their 2-day journey. The Galactic Oversight Committee would be ideal, but their headquarters is on Centauri Prime, heavily monitored, difficult to access without proper credentials. Cale considered the challenge. During their journey, Lyra had shared more details about the research contained on the drive, horrifying accounts of experiments conducted on unwilling subjects, plans for weapons that violated numerous treaties, evidence of bribery and coercion at the highest levels of planetary governments. We need an intermediary, he suggested. Someone established enough to get a message to the committee, but not so prominent that they're being watched. Lyra looked up, a question in her eyes. Kale hesitated, then continued. Before Tacitus Prime, I served with someone who later joined the diplomatic corps. Last I heard, she was working as a liaison officer between the Outer Rim territories and the Central Systems. Not high-profile enough to be a primary target for surveillance, but with the right connections. Do you trust her? Lyra asked, the question layered with meaning. It was a fair point. Kale hadn't spoken to Mira Santes in over 5 years, hadn't reached out even once since his discharge. Their last interaction had been at the inquiry, where she'd testified honestly about the mission, testimony that had contributed to his dishonorable discharge, but that he couldn't fault her for. Yes, he said finally, she has integrity, and she never agreed with how the inquiry concluded. He managed a small smile. She also never liked authority much, at least not the kind that abuses power. This would be right up her alley. Lyra considered this, her natural caution warring with the need to act. Finally, she nodded. How do we reach her? That's the tricky part, Kale admitted. Direct communication would be too easily monitored. We need to use old-school methods, an in-person meeting, or at least a trustworthy courier. According to the transit registers I accessed from the shuttle, there's a diplomatic vessel scheduled to dock here tomorrow, Lyra offered. Not major officials, just routine staff rotation, but they might have information on how to contact someone in the diplomatic corps. It was a start, but a risky one. Approaching an official vessel, even for seemingly innocent information, could draw exactly the kind of attention they were trying to avoid. Let me think about it, Kale said, not dismissing the idea, but reluctant to act too hastily. In the meantime, we should gather supplies, maybe look for alternative transportation. That shuttle is too easily traced. They spent the remainder of the day making careful preparations, purchasing essential supplies with the mercenaries' credits, scouting potential escape routes from their current section of the hub, exploring the black market options for untraceable transportation. All done separately, in short excursions, to minimize the chance of being recognized together. By evening station time, they had the beginnings of a plan. Kale would approach a trusted contact in the hub's maintenance sector, a former smuggler he'd encountered during his military days, now allegedly reformed but still connected to the shadier elements of transit operations. If anyone could arrange discreet transportation or deliver a secure message, it would be Tarak. As they shared a simple meal in their quarters, the artificial lighting dimmed to simulate night cycle, Kale found himself studying Lyra with a new awareness. Despite the danger, despite the uncertainty of their future, there was something undeniably right about having a purpose again, about fighting for something that mattered. And there was something about Lyra herself, her resilience, her determination to expose the truth despite the personal cost, her compassion even for those who had hunted her, that resonated with him in ways he hadn't expected. What? She asked, catching his thoughtful gaze. Kale smiled slightly. Just thinking that for a hermit who didn't want to get involved in anything, I've managed to get very involved very quickly. Lyra's expression softened. You could still walk away, she offered, though he sensed she didn't want him to. Find passage to some other quiet world. Start over. The Institute has no quarrel with you directly. They made it personal when they decided treating sentient beings as laboratory specimens was acceptable. Kale replied, his voice hardening. Some lines shouldn't be crossed, and some things are worth fighting for. The silver markings on Lyra's skin brightened slightly, a physical manifestation of emotion she couldn't, or didn't try to conceal. Thank you, she said simply. Later, as they prepared for sleep in their separate alcoves, Kale found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him here. From isolated exile to companion of a fugitive with galaxy-changing information in less than a week. It should have felt wrong, this sudden upheaval of the carefully constructed emptiness he'd built around himself. Instead, it felt like waking up after a very long sleep. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The first indication that something was wrong came at precisely 0327 station time. A subtle shift in the environmental systems, the air circulation increasing slightly, the temperature dropping by 2 degrees. Minor changes that most wouldn't notice, But Kale's years in space had taught him to be sensitive to such fluctuations. He was out of his sleeping alcove instantly, fully dressed, a habit from his military days he'd never abandoned. Lyra was already awake as well, her superior senses having detected the change even before he did. "Security sweep," she whispered, the silver markings on her skin dimmed to near invisibility. "There." Cycling each section, looking for specific biosignatures. Kale moved to the small console near the door, accessing the public information feed. Nothing unusual was being reported. No security alerts, no announcements of special procedures. A covert operation, then? Severin's people? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Lyra nodded grimly. The Institute has agreements with most major transit hubs, access to security systems in exchange for technological incentives. They must have tracked the shuttle more effectively than we anticipated. Kale considered their options. Their current location would be searched within 20 minutes if the sweep continued at its present pace. Attempting to leave now would mean moving into sections already being monitored. Staying meant almost certain discovery. The maintenance shafts, he decided, moving to collect their essential supplies, the data drive, basic medical kit, compact weapons they'd acquired through Turok's connections. This section is old enough to have manual access points that might not be covered by modern scanning technology. Lyra followed his lead, gathering their few possessions with efficient movements. Where will we go? The entire hub could be compromised. Not the entire hub, Kale corrected, remembering details from his conversation with Turok the previous day. The outer commercial docks operate on independent systems. Legacy infrastructure from before the hub's expansion. Less convenient, less prestigious, but also less integrated with central security. He moved to the environmental control panel in their quarters, examining it briefly before carefully removing the cover. Behind it, as he'd hoped, was an access panel to the station's maintenance system, a relic of older design standards that required manual inspection of critical systems. This station section was built nearly 70 years ago, he explained as he worked to open the panel. Before full automation was standard. There should be a maintenance crawlway leading to the central junction, and from there, we can access the outer ring. The panel came loose with a soft hiss of equalizing pressure. Beyond it, a narrow tunnel stretched into darkness, barely wide enough for an average-sized human to navigate comfortably. "I'll go first," Kale said, securing their pack to his back. "Stay close, and be ready to move quickly if we encounter station personnel." Lyra nodded, her expression resolute. "Lead the way." The maintenance shaft was exactly as cramped as it appeared, forcing them to crawl rather than walk. Dim emergency lighting provided just enough illumination to navigate by, casting everything in an eerie blue glow. The air was stale but breathable, carrying the scent of machine oil and ancient dust. They moved as quietly as possible, pausing at each junction to consult the rudimentary maintenance maps Kale had memorized from his conversation with Turok. The labyrinthine network of tunnels was designed for efficiency rather than intuitive navigation, making their progress slower than Kale would have liked. After nearly 40 minutes of uncomfortable crawling, they reached a larger junction chamber, a nexus where multiple maintenance shafts converged. Here, finally, they could stand upright, though the space was still cramped. "We need to go down 2 levels, Kale said, examining the access ladders that lined the chamber walls. "That should put us in the transfer section between the main hub and the commercial docks." Lyra moved to one of the small viewports in the chamber, reinforced panels designed to allow maintenance workers to check external conditions without exiting the shafts. Through it, they could see one of the hub's main concourses, still active even during night cycle, though with reduced foot traffic. What caught their attention, however, were the security personnel moving systematically through the area. Not the standard transit authority guards with their distinctive blue uniforms, but individuals in civilian clothing who moved with the unmistakable precision of trained operatives. "Institute security," Lyra confirmed quietly. "This is a full-scale operation. They must want the data very badly to commit such resources." Kale watched the methodical sweep with growing concern. These weren't the mercenaries from Xylos. hired muscle working for credits. These were Severin's personal security force, fanatically loyal and extensively trained. If they were involved, the situation was even more dire than they'd realized. We need to move faster, he decided, turning to the access ladder. The commercial docks may not stay independent for long if they're escalating the search this way. They descended quickly, the ladder's metal rungs cool beneath their hands. 2 levels down, they encountered their first obstacle, a sealed maintenance door that should have been accessible. Security protocol, Lyra surmised, examining the electronic lock. They're isolating sections of the maintenance system. Kale studied the mechanism. It was a standard model, not particularly sophisticated but effective enough to slow them down. Can you bypass it? Lyra considered the lock, then reached for the data drive secured at her waist. Yes, but I'll need to use this. The Institute's security protocols are embedded in its programming. She placed the drive against the lock's interface, her silver markings brightening as she established a connection. Her eyes closed in concentration, her breathing slowing as she focused her abilities on manipulating the electronic systems. Kale kept watch, alert for any sign that their presence had been detected. The minutes stretched painfully, each second increasing the risk of discovery. Finally, with a soft click, the lock disengaged. Lyra's eyes opened, the brightness of her markings fading back to a subdued glow. Done, she said, retrieving the data drive. But they'll detect the override eventually. We need to keep moving. Beyond the door, the maintenance shaft continued, gradually widening as it transitioned to the older infrastructure of the commercial docks. The air quality changed subtly, less filtered, carrying the distinctive sense of machine exhaust and the various goods that passed through the trading hub. After another 20 minutes of careful navigation, they reached an exit point that, according to Chiroc's information, should open into a storage area near the independent docking bays. Kale checked the simple mechanical latch, relieved to find it operational, then carefully pushed the panel open. They emerged into a dimly lit storage room, filled with shipping containers of various sizes. The space appeared unoccupied, though the distant sounds of machinery and voices indicated they weren't far from active areas of the dock. We're looking for Bay 37C, Kale said, recalling Turok's instructions. It's a private berth leased to a small trading company that owes him favors. If we can reach it, there should be a vessel preparing for departure within the next few hours. Lyra nodded, already moving toward the storage room's exit. In your contact with the diplomatic corps? One problem at a time, Kale replied grimly. First, we need to get off this station before Severin's people lock it down completely. They navigated through the storage area to a service corridor beyond, then into the main thoroughfare of the commercial docks. Unlike the pristine, carefully regulated environments of the central hub, this section had a distinctly different character. More utilitarian, more diverse, with the barely controlled chaos of a true trading post. Workers from dozens of species moved cargo, merchants haggled over shipments, maintenance crews repaired equipment with more emphasis on functionality than aesthetics. The noise and activity provided excellent cover, allowing Kale and Lyra to move through the area without drawing undue attention. They located Bay 37C near the outer perimeter of the dock section, a modest berth currently occupied by a compact freighter of Signan design. The vessel showed signs of hard use but careful maintenance, its hull marked with the insignia of the Free Trader Collective, a loose association of independent merchants. As they approached, a stocky figure emerged from the ship's cargo bay, a Durathian male with the characteristic azure skin and triple-jointed limbs of a species. He was directing the loading of several containers, but his attention shifted immediately to Kale and Lyra as they neared. "You Turok's friends?" he asked without preamble, his voice a rumbling bass that seemed at odds with his compact frame. Kale nodded, giving the recognition phrase Turok had provided. "Looking for transport to New Horizons." The Durathian grunted affirmatively. "Name's Korf, captain of the Star Vale." He glanced between them, his multifaceted eyes lingering briefly on Lyra's concealed features before returning to Kale. Turok said 2 passengers, minimal luggage, no questions. "That accurate?" Yes, Kale confirmed. Destination? Outbound to the Rimward territories. First stop is Vega Outpost, then continuing to the Argolis cluster. Corv gestured to the final crates being loaded. Departure in 30 minutes. Payment as arranged with Tarak. Kale transferred the agreed-upon credits, the last of what they'd extracted from the mercenaries' accounts. Confirmed. Corv nodded briskly. Quarters are basic, but private. Galley is stocked. Stay out of the engine room, and the bridge unless invited. Standard rules. He turned to resume, supervising the loading, then added as an apparent afterthought. Oh, and we've got one other passenger. Diplomat type. Keeps to herself mostly. Kale and Lyra exchanged a quick glance of surprise and wariness. A diplomat on a cargo freighter was unusual, exactly the kind of anomaly that might represent opportunity or threat. Understood, Kale said carefully. We'll board now if... That's acceptable. Corv waved them toward the entry ramp with a three-fingered hand. Make yourselves comfortable, but be ready for quick departure if Customs decides to be thorough today. They boarded quietly, guided to their quarters by the ship's lone crew member besides Corv, a taciturn human woman who introduced herself simply as Bree. The accommodations were indeed basic. A small cabin with two narrow bunks, minimal storage, and a tiny refresher unit. But after the maintenance shafts, it seemed luxurious enough. Once alone, Lyra turned to Kale, her expression troubled. A diplomat. Coincidence? Unlikely, Kale agreed, securing their few possessions while keeping their weapons easily accessible. But not necessarily a threat. Commercial routes like this sometimes carry lower-level diplomatic staff when official transportation is inconvenient. He shrugged slightly. Could be an opportunity, depending on who they are. Lyra's skepticism was evident, but she didn't argue the point. Instead, she moved to the small viewport, watching the final loading procedures with careful attention. Something else is bothering you, Kale observed, recognizing the tension in her posture. She turned back to him, hesitating before speaking. The data drive. When I used it to bypass the security door, I sensed something. The Institute's research has progressed further than I realized while I was in captivity. The technology isn't just about weaponizing empathic abilities anymore. It's about something much more fundamental. What do you mean? Kale asked, concern growing at her evident distress. Consciousness transfer, Lyra said quietly. They're developing methods to extract and transfer consciousness between hosts. Not just influence or control, but complete replacement. The implications are... She trailed off, clearly disturbed by the possibilities. Kale felt a chill at the revelation. Such technology went beyond weapons or espionage into realms that most civilized systems had declared fundamentally unethical. The ability to forcibly remove a being's consciousness and replace it with another would render all existing concepts of identity and rights meaningless. All the more reason to get this information to the Oversight Committee, he said, his resolve strengthening. This goes beyond corporate malfeasance or treaty violations. This is existential. Lyra nodded, though her troubled expression remained. Before they could discuss it further, the ship's intercom activated with Corv's rumbling voice. All passengers secure for departure. We're moving up the schedule due to dock traffic. Estimated departure in 5 minutes. Kale moved to secure their belongings for flight, but paused when Lyra suddenly stiffened, her attention fixed on something visible through the viewport. Security teams, she said urgently. Institute insignia, disguised but visible if you know what to look for. They've reached the commercial docks. Through the viewport, Kale could see figures moving with purpose through the dock area, their coordinated movements distinctly different from the casual chaos of the regular dock workers. They were still some distance away, but clearly conducting a systematic search. They must have tracked us through the maintenance systems after all, Kale said, calculating rapidly. If Corv can get us out before they reach this section. The ship shuddered slightly as docking clamps released and maneuvering thrusters engaged. They were moving, but so gradually that it was barely perceptible. Standard undocking procedure would take several minutes. Time they might not have if the security teams continued their efficient sweep. We should warn the captain, Lyra suggested. If they identify this ship as our escape route, they might attempt to prevent departure. Kale considered this briefly, then nodded. I'll go. You stay here, keep monitoring their movements. He made his way quickly through the narrow corridors of the freighter toward the bridge, mindful of Korv's instructions about access, but considering this an emergency worthy of bending the rules. As he approached, he heard voices from within. Korv's distinctive rumble, and another, a woman speaking with a measured cadence of someone used to diplomatic discourse. Unnecessary risk, the woman was saying as Kale reached the bridge entrance. If they're searching systematically, confrontation is inevitable. My ship, my decision, Korv responded gruffly. Standard protocols take time. Rushing could. He broke off as Kale appeared in the doorway. The Dorathian's expression shifted to irritation, but before he could speak, the other occupant of the bridge turned to face the interruption. Kale felt his words die in his throat as he found himself looking at a face he hadn't seen in 5 years. Older now, marked by new lines of experience, but unmistakable. Mira, he managed finally, the name emerging as barely more than a whisper. Mira Santes, former military officer and now apparently a diplomat, looked equally stunned. Kale Voros, she said after a moment, her voice steady despite the shock evident in her expression. Of all the cargo ships and all the transit hubs in the galaxy. Korv looked between them with obvious confusion. You know each other? That complicates my no questions policy considerably. Neither of them responded to the captain's comment, locked in a moment of mutual assessment. 5 years of silence and history stretching between them like a physical presence. Finally, Mira broke the tension with a small, rueful smile. You look like hell, Voros. But alive, which is more than the official record suggests. Reports of my death were... Kale paused, searching for the right words. Greatly exaggerated, Mira supplied, a hint of their old rapport surfacing briefly. More like wishful thinking from command, Kale corrected, allowing himself a slight smile before remembering the urgency of their situation. But this reunion might be short-lived. There are Institute security teams searching the docks. They're looking for me and my companion. Myra's expression sharpened, professional focus replacing personal surprise. Institute, as in the Neurobiological Research Institute. Her gaze became calculating. What exactly have you gotten yourself into, Kale? Something worth dying for, he replied simply. Something worth fighting for. A subtle shift occurred in Myra's demeanor, recognition of the significance of those words to both of them. On Tacitus Prime, in those final moments before everything went wrong, those had been her words to him, a reminder of purpose when he'd lost his way. Captain, she said, turning to Korv, how quickly can you complete departure procedures without raising suspicions? Korv huffed, his azure skin darkening with what might have been annoyance or concentration. 7 minutes minimum, without triggering automated security protocols. Unless you're suggesting we ignore protocols entirely, which would bring station defenses online. Not yet, Mira decided, moving to the bridge viewport to assess the situation. They haven't identified this vessel specifically. Standard procedures, but accelerate where possible. Korv grunted affirmatively and returned his attention to the ship's controls, muttering something about humans and their complicated lives. Mira turned back to Kale. Your quarters. Now, we need to talk before those security teams get any closer. He led her back through the corridor to the small cabin where Lyra waited. As they entered, Lyra turned from the viewport, her posture instantly alert at the sight of the stranger. The silver markings on her skin brightened defensively before she controlled the reaction. Lyra, this is Mira Santes, Kale introduced carefully. Former military colleague, current diplomat, and apparently our fellow passenger. And you are a Zealer, Mira observed, studying Lyra with professional interest. A long way from the Andromeda colonies. Lyra's gaze shifted to Kale, a silent question in her expression. We can trust her, he said, hoping he was right. In fact, she might be exactly who we've been looking for. That depends entirely on what you're involved in, Mira noted, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp. The Institute doesn't deploy security teams for minor infractions. Whatever you're carrying must be significant. Lyra hesitated only briefly before reaching a decision. She removed the data drive from its secure pouch and held it up. Evidence of crimes that violate every ethical standard recognized by civilized systems. Human experimentation, consciousness manipulation and transfer, weapons development using sentient beings as components, all sanctioned at the highest levels of the Institute. Myra's expression remained controlled, but Kale, who knew her well, could see the shock and revulsion she carefully contained. "We need to get this to the Galactic Oversight Committee," Kale explained, "but directly approaching them would be too dangerous. We need an intermediary, someone with diplomatic credentials, but independent enough not to be under the Institute's influence." Understanding dawned in Myra's eyes. "Someone like me?" She was quiet for a moment, weighing implications. "You realize what you're asking? If the Institute has the reach and influence you suggest, anyone who touches this becomes a target." "Yes," Lyra said simply. "I've been that target for 16 days. Kale, for nearly 7. Now we're asking you to share that risk." Mira studied them both, her gaze lingering on Kale. "You believe in this," she said finally. "Not a question, but an observation." "I do," he confirmed. "More than I believed in anything for a very long time." "Something,"